What's your name?
Kunta Kinte.
My drum. We're getting north to freedom.
Stop that.
When Roots was adapted for television, it drew the largest audience in the medium's history. It's estimated that some 130 million people saw at least a portion of Roots when it was broadcast.
The later you are in another way is how much of the book is fact and how much is fiction. Well, a whole lot of it's fiction. Yeah. Just like any history book you get, a whole lot of it's fiction.
First aired on ABC in January 1977, the miniseries Roots was a cultural phenomenon. But did you know there were some facts the producers kept hidden from fans? Roots is that one miniseries that left an indelible mark on American television history.
James ain't right for Nick Fiddler.
But apparently there are some interesting events that the producers didn't want fans to find out. Facts that would make the series appear less authentic. We'll get into that, but for those of you that don't know or remember Roots, here's a recap. Over 8 nights, millions of viewers across the nation were glued to their screens, watching the powerful story unfold. In fact, more than 100 million people tuned in for the final episode alone, making it one of the most watched programs of all time.
When Roots was adapted for television, it drew the largest audience in the medium's history. It's estimated that some 130 million people saw at least a portion of Roots when it was broadcast.
The show was a massive success, earning 37 Emmy nominations and winning 9. It also took home a Peabody Award and a Golden Globe for Best TV Drama. But as groundbreaking as Roots was, there were some controversies that simmered beneath the surface, with producers allegedly trying to keep certain facts from the public, possibly to preserve the show's legacy. Let's dive in deeper. Roots was based on Alex Haley's novel Roots, the saga of an American family, which was published in 1976. The book told the story of Haley's ancestors, starting with Kunta Kinte, a Mandinka warrior from West Africa who was captured and sold into slavery in America in 1767. The novel traced his lineage through 7 generations, ultimately leading to Haley himself. The story captivated readers and became a bestseller, selling more than 1.5 million copies in just 7 months. It also sparked a renewed interest in genealogy and the history of slavery in America.
And when a book came out where a black family had been able, a black person had been able to trace his family as far back as Roots went, I know that it generated a tremendous rise in usage of genealogical materials.
However, as Roots continued to dominate the cultural conversation, questions began to arise. Was everything in the story true? Was it a factual account, or was it more of a work of fiction? Initially, Roots was marketed as faction, a blend of fact and fiction. While the dialogue and many specific events in the story were obviously imagined, Haley insisted that the core of the narrative was grounded in truth. According to him, much of his story was drawn from family oral history, as well as extensive research in libraries and archives. In the book's final chapter, Haley wrote, "To the best of my knowledge and of my effort, every lineage statement within Roots is from either my African or American families, carefully preserved oral history, much of which I have been able conventionally to corroborate with documents. Those documents, along with the myriad textual details of what were contemporary indigenous lifestyles, cultural history, and such that give Roots flesh, have come from years of intensive research in 50-odd libraries, archives, and other repositories on 3 continents." However, as Roots gained more attention, cracks in the story began to show. Critics and scholars started to investigate Haley's claims, and it became clear that not everything was as it seemed.
He spoke for years before he wrote the book about this experience, all over the United States.
One of the first major controversies surrounding Roots was the issue of plagiarism. In the late 1970s, author Harold Corlander took Alex Haley to court, accusing him of copying significant portions of his novel, The African, published in 1967. The court case revealed that Haley had indeed plagiarized parts of Corlander's work. In fact, the judge overseeing the case didn't mince words, stating, "Copying was there, period." Haley eventually settled the case out of court for a hefty sum, as it was determined that at least 81 passages from The African had been copied into Roots. This revelation cast a shadow over Haley's work, raising questions about the originality of his widely celebrated book.
They should have done a documentary about his research, because it was, I mean, it really should have been on the History Channel or something.
But the plagiarism case wasn't the only controversy that threatened Haley's narrative. As historians and genealogists began digging deeper into his research, they uncovered several critical errors and inconsistencies in his family history. Much of Haley's story simply didn't hold up under scrutiny. For instance, in April 1977, the Sunday Times in London published an article titled "Tangled Roots" by journalist Mark Ottaway, which challenged Haley's account of Kunta Kinte and his supposed African ancestry. According to Ottaway's investigation, the only African confirmation of Haley's family history came from a man named Keba Kanga Fofana, a griot, or oral historian, from the village of Jufure in the Gambia. However, Fofana was not considered a genuine griot by many in the community, raising doubts about the reliability of his testimony. It didn't help Haley's case when the head of the Gambian National Archives wrote him a letter, expressing serious concerns about Fofana's credibility. As the story continued to circulate, Fofana changed key details in his account, which Haley had initially relied on to trace his ancestry back to Kunta Kinte. This led to speculation that Haley might have shaped the narrative to fit his needs, rather than presenting an entirely accurate account of his family's past. In 1981, Donald R. Wright, a historian who specialized in the West African slave trade, further questioned the authenticity of Haley's research. Wright reported that elders and griots in the Gambia couldn't provide detailed information about people living before the mid-19th century. Yet somehow everyone in Jufure seemed to have heard of Kunta Kinte. Wright suggested that Haley's visits to the Gambia, where he had shared his family story with locals, had led to a case of circular reporting. Essentially, Haley had told his version of events to so many people that it eventually became part of the local oral tradition. People were simply repeating his story back to him as if it were fact.
Nobody knew where the Kambibalanga River was. A student at a university we taught said, well, I know where the Kambibalanga is. I live near it in Gambia. The guy said, what? And I say, well, Dad, yes, the Kambibalanga was in the Gambia.
Another issue with Haley's version of events was the depiction of Jufure as an isolated village where, in 1767, the inhabitants had only heard vague rumors about white men. In reality, Jufure was located just 2 miles from James Island, a major British trading outpost established by the Royal Africa Company in 1661. This fort was a hub for the transatlantic slave trade, and the King of Bara had allowed the British to establish it with the understanding that his subjects could not be sold into slavery without his permission. The idea that Jufure's residents had never encountered white traders by 1767 simply didn't align with the historical reality of the region. Haley himself admitted to some creative liberties when it came to timing. He had chosen the year 1767 as the moment when the king's soldiers came, to match the dates he had uncovered during his American research. But this decision further highlighted the tension between fact and fiction and roots. Historian Gary B. Mills and genealogist Elizabeth Schoen Mills, experts in Black American and Southern history, took a deep dive into Alex Haley's research, retracing his steps through census records, deed books, and wills to see if his claims and roots held up. What they found was surprising, and for many, disappointing. Their conclusion was blunt. The very plantation records, wills, and censuses that Haley had used to support his story not only failed to back him up, but actually contradicted every pre-Civil War statement about the Afro-American lineage he described in Roots. It was a serious blow to the credibility of the narrative Haley had crafted. For example, Haley had written that Kunta Kinte was brought to America on the Lord Ligonier's ship in 1767, sold to the Waller family and renamed Toby.
Toby. Yes, his name should be Toby.
However, the Millses discovered that the Waller family had already owned a slave named Toby by 1762, 5 years before the Lord Ligoniers supposedly docked in Annapolis. This revelation pointed to a clear case of confirmation bias. Haley had only searched for records after 1767, which conveniently fit his narrative. It seems he ignored earlier documents that would have undermined the Kunta Kinte story he was trying to piece together. Furthermore, Haley's portrayal of life on the Waller plantation didn't add up. According to the Millses, there was no cook named Bell, and Dr. Waller didn't even own his own plantation. In reality, Dr. Waller was disabled and lived with his brother John, which was a far cry from the version of events presented in Roots. Another discrepancy concerned Toby's fate. The records indicated that Toby had likely died before 1782, which was problematic because, according to Roots, Kunta Kinte's daughter Kizzy wasn't even born until 8 years later.
To a man that is good in his sight, wisdom.
Is that you reading?
On top of that, Missy Ann, Kizzy's supposed childhood playmate, couldn't have existed in the way Haley described, as Anne Murray, the woman believed to be Missy Ann, was already a grown woman and married during the time period in question. Even more striking was the fact that the Millses found no records of anyone named Kizzy being owned by any of the Wallers. Haley's next major piece of documentary evidence was from much later, the 1870 census listing for the household of Tom Murray, a descendant of Kizzy. But this left a staggering 90-year gap, during which Haley relied solely on his family's oral history to fill in the blanks. The Millses looked into the oral history and, unfortunately for Haley, they found no historical records to support these family stories. Tom Lee, contrary to the portrayal in Roots, didn't come from a poor background. In fact, he was born into a wealthy planter family. When historians dug into the records, they found no mention of a Kizzy or her son, George, among Tom Lee's slaves. Furthermore, there was no evidence of a mixed-race George Lee being married to a woman named Matilda, as Haley had described. One of the key elements in the Roots narrative was that George Leah, a talented chicken trainer, had been sent to England when Tom Lee ran into financial troubles in the 1850s. However, there was a major flaw in this claim. Tom Lee actually died during the winter of 1844 to 1845, long before the financial difficulties supposedly occurred. Additionally, Haley's depiction of George Leah gaining his freedom in England and returning to the U.S. didn't hold water either.
All you need is a willing master.
By the time Haley claimed George was sent to England, slavery had been abolished in most of the British Empire by the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. The Millses pointed out that it was highly improbable that an American slave, having gained freedom in England, would willingly return to the United States where slavery was still legal. The 1772 Somerset versus Stewart case further supported this argument. It ruled that there was no legal basis for slavery in England, meaning any slave brought to England from elsewhere was considered free the moment they arrived. While there were still cases of people being held as slaves in England even after this ruling, the idea that George Lee would voluntarily return to the U.S. as a slave seemed far-fetched. In light of all these discrepancies, Haley himself admitted that he may have been misled by his African research. He even considered labeling Roots as a historical novel rather than presenting it as a factual account. Yet when the Sunday Times article by Mark Ottaway called his research into question, Haley pushed back, calling the article unwarranted, unfair, and unjust. He defended his work, insisting that he had no reason to doubt the reliability of Kebakanga Fofana, the griot who had played a significant role in identifying Kunta Kinte's African roots. Haley's defense of his work didn't stop there. He criticized his detractors for relying so heavily on written records, which he argued were often incomplete or inaccurate when it came to documenting slave births and ownership.
Another way is how much of the book is fact and how much is fiction. Well, a whole lot of it's fiction. Just like any history book you get, a whole lot of it's fiction.
For Haley, oral history held far more value, especially in the context of Black genealogy. He believed that well-preserved oral traditions were often the most reliable sources, particularly when written records were scarce or inconsistent. The Millses, during their extensive research, actually found a more accurate match to the Haley family's oral history than Alex Haley himself had uncovered. They discovered that Dr. William Waller's father, Colonel William Waller, owned a slave known as Hopping George, so named because of a foot injury. This description matched some of the details from Haley's family legends. Additionally, Colonel Waller also owned a slave named Isbel, who the Millses believed could be the inspiration for Belle in the Haley family stories. Moreover, Tom Lee's father, who lived in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, may have bought some of Haley's ancestors from the Wallers. When the Lee family later relocated to North Carolina, it's likely they took their slaves with them. Interestingly, the Lees lived near the Murray and Holt families, which could explain some of the connections in Haley's narrative. In the post-Civil War records, the Millses even found 3 women named Kizzy associated with the Lee and Murray families. Another potential link that fit Haley's family legend, although not exactly as he described it. Historian Henry Louis Gates Jr., who was a personal friend of Alex Haley, later shared his own reservations about some of Haley's claims. Gates, an expert in African American history, admitted that even though Roots made a profound impact, it was highly unlikely that Haley had actually pinpointed the exact African village from which his ancestors originated. Gates emphasized that while Roots was an important cultural milestone, it was more a work of imagination than a purely historical account. Nevertheless, its significance lay in the way it captured the public's imagination and sparked a renewed interest in genealogy and African American history. Gates himself went on to host popular genealogy-based TV series such as African American Lives and Finding Your Roots, where his team used DNA testing alongside extensive historical records to verify family histories. These methods, which were unavailable during Haley's time, provided more precise insights into ancestry and genealogy, reflecting the growing accuracy of such research in the years following Roots. As for Haley, after the success of Roots, he began writing another novel, this time focused on his paternal grandmother, Queen Jackson Haley. Unfortunately, Haley passed away before he could finish the book, but it was later completed and published posthumously as Queen, the Story of an American Family. This story further explored Haley's lineage, adding more layers to his family's complex history.
Not even about my pappy.
Interestingly, DNA testing conducted years later on Alex Haley's nephew, Chris Haley, revealed some surprising findings. The results showed that Alex Haley's paternal grandfather, Alec Haley, Queen Haley's husband, likely had Scottish ancestry, tracing back to a man named William Harwell Ball, who was an overseer on a slave plantation in Alabama. But despite the historical inaccuracies in Roots, there are still many reasons why the miniseries remains a fan favorite to this day. Adrian Sebro, a professor of media studies at the University of Texas at Austin, attributes the show's success to its groundbreaking portrayal of Black lives on television. According to Sebro, Roots played a pivotal role in shaping how we view television and how stories about Black life, particularly the painful and often untold history of slavery, were brought to the forefront. Before Roots aired, much of Black life on TV was showcased through sitcoms like Sanford and Son, Good Times, and The Jeffersons. These shows, while significant in their own right, focused more on the comedic aspects of everyday life. Roots broke away from that mold by diving into the brutal realities of slavery, an experience that was nothing to joke about, especially for Black Americans. It was a dramatic shift that showcased Black history in a way that had never been done before on such a large scale. Sebro explained in an interview with CNN, "It really set the stage for the breadth and depth of storytelling that can be done on television." For many viewers, particularly in Black communities, the series opened up conversations about a history that had often been either ignored or downplayed in mainstream media. And while the show did address the horrors of slavery, it was still somewhat restrained in its depictions. Eric Deggans, an NPR media analyst and critic, pointed out that Roots didn't show the full extent of the brutality of chattel slavery because it was simply too horrific to display on television. Even so, the show managed to tell the truth about slavery, which was a huge step forward at the time. Deggans also noted that the way slavery was portrayed in Roots would likely face more challenges today, given the political climate in certain states where officials are trying to alter how America's darkest history is taught in schools. "There's too many ways I think folks are able to easily not talk about these things," Sebro said, expressing concern about how younger generations, even those in college, might not fully understand critical aspects of American history, such as the existence of the Ku Klux Klan or the history of slavery itself. Both Sebro and Deggans emphasized how important it is to understand the painful history of Black Americans in order to truly grasp the full story of America. As Deggans put it, "You can't really understand America if you don't understand that journey."
What's your name?
The legacy of Roots also revolutionized television in ways that were unexpected at the time. ABC, the network that aired Roots, was initially hesitant about creating a show so focused on slavery, fearing it might be too explicit or too niche for a wide audience. They worried that viewers might reject it, so they made the strategic decision to air all the episodes in 1 week before the February sweeps ratings period. The idea was to minimize the impact on their earnings if the show didn't perform well. But instead of being rejected, Roots became a cultural sensation. This strategy of airing the episodes back-to-back effectively created one of the earliest examples of binge viewing, long before streaming services made it the norm. As the word spread about the quality of the show, especially within Black communities, it became a ratings phenomenon and helped establish the TV miniseries as a powerful format. When asked how Roots affected Black Americans specifically, Deggans shared some profound insights. He explained that, unlike white Americans who often trace their lineage back to the country's founders, Black Americans had been denied that opportunity due to the horrors of slavery, which severed family connections and destroyed historical records. Roots changed that narrative by giving Black people a sense of connection to their past. It provided a framework for tracing heritage in a way that had been lost to generations due to the devastating impact of slavery. Deggans emphasized that Roots gave Black Americans a gift, a way to trace their ancestry and feel a deeper connection to their heritage, something white Americans had been able to do for centuries.
Anchor meaning for us, like the Black experience. Well, I like to think that what Roots did was give insight into what that meant.
The original Roots series garnered overwhelmingly positive reviews, cementing its place as a television landmark. Even years after its release, it continued to resonate with audiences and critics alike. On the review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes, the series was later rated 76% fresh based on 32 reviews. The critics' consensus highlighted how, while the show may have streamlined some of the nuances found in Alex Haley's original book for the sake of more concise storytelling, the exceptional performances and the inherent power of the generational saga made for groundbreaking television. The consensus stated, Roots may shave off the nuances of Alex Haley's landmark book for the sake of slicker storytelling, but excellent performances and the intrinsic power of this generational tale make for revelatory television. Variety also praised the series at the time of its release, calling it a strong production bolstered by standout performances. One of the breakout stars was newcomer LeVar Burton, who portrayed the young Kunta Kinte with an emotional depth that struck a chord with viewers. Variety specifically noted his effectiveness in bringing the character to life, stating that Burton was effective as the African youngster trapped into slavery. Veteran actor Edward Asner also received high praise for his portrayal of Captain Davies, the slave ship captain who initially leads Kunta Kinte into bondage. Asner had previously dominated the screen in Rich Man, Poor Man the year before, and his presence in Roots was similarly commanding. Decades later, the influence of Roots was still recognized. In 2023, Variety ranked Roots as the 10th greatest TV show of all time, a testament to its lasting impact on both television and American culture. The show's depiction of the brutal realities of slavery and its focus on African American history resonated with multiple generations, helping to set the standard for storytelling in television history. In 2016, the History Channel decided to revisit the powerful story, producing a remake of the Roots miniseries.
Your name is your spirit. Your name is your shield.
This new adaptation was made after the network acquired the rights from David L. Wolper's son, Mark Wolper, as well as from Alex Haley's estate. Mark Wolper took on the role of executive producer for the new version. The 8-hour miniseries drew from both Haley's novel and the original 1977 series, but offered a fresh, contemporary perspective to resonate with modern audiences. Premiering on Memorial Day, May 30th, 2016, the updated Roots spanned 4 nights and featured an ensemble cast of esteemed actors. Forrest Whitaker played Fiddler, a pivotal character in the original series, while Anna Paquin took on the role of Nancy Holt. Jonathan Rhys Meyers portrayed Tom Leah, the conflicted and morally ambiguous slave owner, and Annika Noni Rose embodied the strong and resilient Kizzy. Other notable cast members included Tip T.I., Harris as Cyrus, Emma Yahtzee Cornialdi as Belle, Matthew Good as Dr. William Waller, and Makey Pfeiffer as Jerusalem. The remake also introduced a younger generation of actors, such as Regé-Jean Page, who portrayed Chicken George, and Malachi Kirby, who took on the iconic role of Kunta Kinte. Lawrence Fishburne played Alex Haley, the author of the story himself.